Welcome to Season 2 of the Crypto Pulse podcast, your ultimate guide to the world of crypto, Bitcoin, and world economics. We're here to guide you through the crypto universe with thought-provoking topics, in-depth knowledge, and information to help you make informed decisions. We'll also be interviewing some of the best minds in the industry, such as CEOs of crypto projects, traders, economists, authors, and development teams from around the globe. And now for the episode.
Hello and welcome back to the Crypto Pulse podcast for another one of our weekly episodes about crypto and macroeconomics. Ben, it's great to see you, and you're all the way in Copenhagen at the moment.
I am in Copenhagen, doing some of my other work for Fashion Week out here at the moment, which has been a nice change from the world of crypto and finance.
Other work? You do other work outside of crypto?
I do. I know. It's a strange thing, but yeah, it's nice. I know that the UK at the moment have got a heat wave, and Copenhagen is a cool 19 degrees today, so I'm actually very glad to be out of the country.
I'm sat in my office at home wearing a vest and short in this, it's like a sauna in here at the moment. So let's hope we don't get any hardware issues today, because
fingers crossed.
The weather has made podcasting a little difficult. So we haven't done one of our weekly episodes in a couple of weeks, purely because, well, we've been traveling, we've had other things going on. But not only that, we've had some incredible guest interviews. In fact, we had some brilliant ones come up over the last few weeks, especially with Marshall Hayner of Proton and MetalPay. That has been one of the most popular episodes this year. So if you haven't listened to that one, make sure you do. Where should we even start? I mean, it's probably good to start with some of the announcements this week from the Fed and just a bit of an overview of what's gone on in the market.
Yeah, so maybe let's start by talking about Bitcoin's price action, because this is the number one question that I get asked by people when I'm out and about and people online. So at the moment, it's no secret, Bitcoin's having a little bit of a rally. At the point of recording this today, we're hovering around $24,600. And the question which is on everybody's mind is, has the bear market finished, and are we now about to enter into a brand new bull market phase? I think when we try to answer that question, we really have to just consider the macro backdrop. And we've talked about this on the show so much this year. We've talked about high inflation. We've talked about interest rate hikes. We've talked about the war with Russia. We've talked about food shortages. And, also now the fact that most major countries, and particularly the UK, are expected to enter into a long recession period. Now, most analysts are forecasting that could last up to 18 months or 5 quarters. But of course, we never know. I would probably err on the side of caution here when looking at Bitcoin, and I would probably say that this is just a bear market rally, and not to be diving in with any large positions, especially not leverage positions, and to probably just wait for this to play out until we reclaim some key levels.
Yeah, as we've mentioned several times before on the show, our personal strategy, and this is not financial advice, this is just sharing what we're doing, is that we're just dollar cost averaging in each week in small amounts. And that's, I would say, probably over the last couple of months, that's worked reasonably well for us, actually. So I think if you've got a conservative and cautious approach to what's going on at the minute, that's great. But I mean, if your time horizon on Bitcoin is longer than 6 months, which it should be, then if you're going to be looking at price in 5 or 10 years, I think you'll look back to this year and go, oh my God, Bitcoin was so cheap.
Yeah, you're 100% right, and it depends on what your strategy is here. Because there are really two camps of people. You've got long-term investors and you've got traders. And I think for new people getting into the crypto markets, they tend to not know which they are. They'll behave like traders, but call themselves investors. And I mean by that they'll buy and sell Bitcoin based on short-term price action, but in the same breath be convinced that Bitcoin's going to 100K long term. And as we always say, you really just have to try and take the emotion out of it. And dollar cost averaging is a really good way to do that. And just to set yourself a really small weekly limit, it's a regular purchase. You buy no matter what the price is doing. And what you do is create an average entry price over however many months. And as you say, it's worked for us. It works for most people and tends to be a pretty foolproof way to enter into a position, whether it's stock markets, commodities, or crypto.
Absolutely. So I was in shock yesterday. I was going to say earlier on this week, but it was only yesterday that the CPI announcement came out, and I think the general consensus on Twitter and from various different talking heads and people with various opinions was that inflation would have gone down by a small amount, and the markets would respond positively. Now, with the inflation rates of where they were, this isn't good news. But what markets seem to like at the minute is predictable news. So we saw a bit of a rally. What were your thoughts about the announcement? And I don't know whether you've caught some of the things that Joe Biden was saying.
I actually did not see the CPI announcement yesterday. Are you going to educate me and tell me what it was?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I've got a bit of information here, and I'll go go through this for the benefit of our listeners that didn't see it either. So the US Bureau of Labor Statistics released CPI data for July, showing consumer prices rose 8.5% compared to July 2021 prices. This shows no change in the total all item index compared with the last month, only some marginal increases in the food index and services index. So nothing important there, just food. This shows a slight cooling from 9.1%, which was in June.
Right.
So basically what Biden was saying, that inflation's gone down. There's no inflation in July. There wasn't any inflation. So everybody's taken that sound clip on Twitter and gone, what is this guy talking about? These inflation rates, as we know, they can change the basket of goods and services that they put in there anyway. But he was kind of just saying it was no problem, and that the economy was on the right track. And I just couldn't believe this was coming out of the mouth of the president of the United States.
Yeah, well, I mean, arguably Joe Biden is a few sandwiches short of a picnic, I think, to put it politely. But
he's a few picnics short of a picnic, I think.
It's encouraging to see that inflation is coming down, because obviously we were up at 9.1%, I believe, the month before. So 8.5 does suggest that there is a cooling off. Most of that, I would say, is largely down to petrol prices coming down, though, right? Because that is, of course, included in the consumer price index. And the US have gone some way to try and sort of reduce the price at the pump. So I mean, the argument that I make with this CPI all the time is the stuff that should be in that index isn't in that index. And we're talking about really volatile items like food, for example, wheat-based products, bread, eggs, where consumers, like you and I, are actually paying 200-300% more than they were just 3 years ago. And that's the stuff that really matters. Of course, electronic goods are coming down in price because manufacturers are able to make them more cheaply. They're able to source materials more cheaply. And over time, the cost of TVs have come down considerably. But for families on the breadline, that's not really the stuff that counts. So I think there's still some way to go, really, before the US can sort of get their inflation down to the 2% target. And I think most analysts are kind of forecasting that's going to take at least another 4 to 5 quarters. And what that means, I guess, is that, we probably are entering into a period of recession, and to sort of discount this bear market rally, I don't think it's anything to get too excited about.
I'm definitely not excited. Long-term bullish in this whole space. Short-term, not excited at all. But of course, it also depends on what you define as a recession. And if you change the definition of anything, then, you can then decide what something means. So that's the world that we live in now.
I actually recently changed the definition of Olympian to mean an average build man that goes to the gym a couple of times a week. So I'm going to be in the Olympics Hall of Fame any day now, I hope.
Oh my God, I can't wait. We'll definitely sponsor you. I wonder how well you do. Which category are you entering in?
Well, I don't know, the sort of like
women's relay?
Maybe. That's a dangerous discussion, but yes, potentially.
Should we move on to our first main topic of today? And this is around the whole saga of Tornado Cash, which has been quite concerning.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So the US Treasury this week has sanctioned the currency mixer Tornado Cash. So on Monday, the Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctioned the virtual currency mixer, which had been accused of being used to launder more than $7 billion worth of virtual currency since its creation in 2019. And it's been tying some of that laundered money to the Lazarus Group, which is the North Korean state-sponsored hacking group that were involved in the Axie Infinity attack in April of this year. So for some context, the Office of Foreign Asset Control is a division of the US Treasury that focuses on economic sanctions. They also create something called the SDN list, which is basically a list of anybody who is suspected of supporting terrorism or is an enemy of the state and should therefore be denied access to the US and its financial system. Now, it's a little bit of a controversial one because OFAC can technically add anybody to that list that they deem to be a national security
Anyone
risk.
they don't like.
Right. And I think at the moment the document is about 1,910 pages long. There are literally tens of thousands of individuals and companies which are put on that list. People get added for all sorts of reasons. They might be suspected of, dealing arms, or they might be suspected of supporting drugs coming into the country. But OFAC as a division, they can add you without technically having any proof. It could just be a suspicion, which sets an interesting precedent. But this week, as you say, they've gone ahead and added Tornado Cash. But one of the really interesting things about this SDN list is that the list is published online, but you as an American individual have to check that list to make sure that whoever you're doing business with is not on that list. Because if you accidentally do, let's say you do an international deal with somebody and you hadn't checked to see whether they were, whether they were listed on the SDN, you then would also be added to the SDN, which is a bit bonkers. It's been a really interesting case because they've added the entire company, which means that any law-abiding citizen in the US now cannot transact with them.
In 2018, Bitcoin addresses appeared for the first time in the SDN list. These said addresses were used by two Iranians who were involved in a ransomware scheme, and Iran was a sanctioned country, and the two were doing illegal activities. So it made sense for OFAC to add the two personal addresses to the list.
It seems a little bit of a futile effort. Bitcoin addresses can be whipped up in seconds. You can create a brand new cold wallet in under a few minutes. So they're going to be putting Bitcoin addresses on the list forever and a day. Just because you put one on, it doesn't mean that whoever's been sanctioned can't just set up another one that is anonymous, that requires no KYC. So I don't know if this is a perfect solution to what they're trying to achieve, but I understand that it is one way of doing it.
I think they're trying to flex their muscles, aren't they? And I think if they can deter people from using crypto, then they will. I mean, it's just, I don't know, or certainly deter people from using crypto unless it's full KYC, cryptos that they like, they're American companies, and they've given them the green light. So I don't think their approach is going to work particularly well. So in May of 2022, OFAC added the first crypto mixer service to the SDN list called Blender.io after being accused of helping North Korea launder money associated with the Axie Infinity case, which is similar to the Tornado Cash situation. When they added Blender.io to the SDN list, they identified an unincorporated organization, a series of names, a website, and a .onion address, which is an online address used on the dark web, and a series of Bitcoin addresses that were relevant to using the Blender.io mixer service. So they aren't listing the properties of a specific person. It is a real entity with real people behind it, but they specifically hadn't been identified on the list. The reason this is fundamentally different to the Tornado Cash situation is that Blender.io was a centralized custodial Bitcoin mixer. every single address the OFAC listed had a private key that controlled movement in and out of that address. If you sent money to BMIX, it's only the person who controls said private key that controls the mixing of the funds and giving you a transaction back to control your privacy.
Interesting. I'm not sure I fully understand how these mixers work, to be honest, but I kind of get that they are complex systems that require multiple addresses to be set up. So I'm not 100% sure that this is a perfect solution. I think this seems to be just something that's grabbing headlines, in my opinion.
In the Tornado Cash case, the entity being sanctioned is not described thoroughly whatsoever. All that is mentioned is the following: Tornado Cash, aka Tornado Cash Classic, aka Tornado Cash Nova, website tornado.cash. and then a list of Ethereum smart contract addresses with no additional guidance on whether it's the people behind those contracts or any additional information. It's just those contracts. So Tornado is a non-custodial mixing software. It's instantiated on Ethereum at these specific smart contracts, and the funds that you send when you use this software are not controlled by a person. It's controlled by software logic, which is open source and grabbed from open source libraries. So if you pay that address, you're not paying a sanctioned individual. You're not buying the assets of a sanctioned individual. You're not even interacting with the intellectual property of a sanctioned individual.
Yeah, so it goes on to kind of explain, and I sort of understand this. So the reason that this is so different is because that the sanction now is not a sanction on a specific individual. This is actually a sanction on all Americans using a specific tool. So it's kind of it's reversed the direction in which the sanction is placed. So we're now not sanctioning a specific person. We're sanctioning all Americans from using from interacting with a specific tool, which is a massive change in policy and regulation from them, because they've never done that before.
I guess they can just do what they want. I guess it's not something that has to go to vote or to be approved. I mean, I don't really know. I don't know enough about the lawmaking in the US. I guess that kind of stuff has to go through the Senate, right? But these government organizations seem to almost have an unlimited amount of power.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too sort of conspiracy-esque on this, but it does seem like a lot of these sort of independent regulatory bodies have an unbelievable amount of power over the economy, regulations, securities, investment, sanctions, because none of this is really controlled by a specific political party. If you've got groups like OFAC that are able to just write a new policy and say that, well, we're now sanctioning anyone who interacts with this, it's I don't know. I mean, what's to stop them just sanctioning Americans from interacting with the Bitcoin blockchain at any point? You know, I think there doesn't seem to be any sort of checks and balances in this. But I suppose you just have to trust that they have best interests at heart. And hopefully logic will prevail.
Well, it seems like a very rash, like overzealous response in some ways. But I think they've probably looked at it and thought, right, what can we do? And they've just done this because it's kind of like an umbrella solution to so many things that's, you know, as we said on the show before, a lot of these, whether it's the US or whether it's other governments, they don't particularly have the expertise or the insight into actually like looking at things from a balanced perspective. They've got a job to do, and that's it. And this is where I think the crypto community and lawmakers and governments and policymakers need to come together to create something. And the US, you know, it seems to be falling behind on that somewhat. So we'd love to get somebody from the US government on to talk about what they're doing. But, you know, speaking to some of the CEOs and entrepreneurs in this space, people that are building, they're absolutely crying out for better regulation and a better framework.
And just to finish on this point before we move on to our Bank of England story, the sort of fallout of this particular sanction has meant that the Tornado Cash code base, which it was on GitHub, And GitHub is it's a version control system for software for writing programs. Developers use it all the time. It's a great place to store your code before you deploy it. It's a third-party tool. But the Tornado Cash code base had been suspended and a few commits had been deleted. So Tornado Cash's founder, Roman Semenov, explained that his GitHub account was suspended, saying, "My GitHub account was just suspended. Is writing open source code illegal now?" And it seems that GitHub, which is a private company, have responded to this particular sanction by removing the code base from its platform, which is a very, very dangerous precedent because open source software is very often stored in places like GitHub and GitTools, which of course are still Web3 platforms and controlled by central entities. So I think we have to be careful with stuff like this. We've seen things like this before, where payment providers have withdrawn their support from particular e-commerce platforms just because they don't like what's being sold. And of course, this is why crypto and Bitcoin specifically is so good, because you just can't sanction it.
You can't. You can only sanction the use of it.
Yeah,
which is just a bizarre approach. Okay, all right. So should we move on to our final topic of our weekly show, which is the Bank of England?
Yeah. So last week, the Bank of England's 9-member policy committee voted 8-1 to raise interest rates by 50 basis points, up to 1.75%, which is the biggest increase in 27 years. This was most likely influenced by the Fed, and the ECB taking similarly aggressive steps in interest rate rises, with the latter even injecting billions of euros into highly indebted Eurozone countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain to keep them afloat. So lots of people are criticising the modern economic system because of these interest rate hikes. But honestly, the state of the modern economic system is inherently broken and has been for a while. Inflation doesn't mean rising prices, really. It's rising prices in the basket of goods in which the Bank of England tracks. And it doesn't include things like housing prices, but it does include things like furniture in the house. So the logic is pretty backwards, and it means that inflation has really been rising for years, but not in the eyes of the bank. And now, of course, the CPI is starting to catch up. And as we said at the top of the show, the consumer price index is only good for the things that are tracked. And, as this article rightly points out, it doesn't track things like bread, eggs, wheat-based products. It doesn't track, things like crisps and, things that people eat. It's we're paying 200-300% more for loaves of bread than we were, but it hasn't been tracked, because it's just not part of the consumer price index.
Yeah, I mean, it was inevitable that interest rates were going to go up. I don't know why it took them so long. Really, it felt like they were well behind the curve there. But of course, this also means increase in interest rates on mortgages as well. And I think we're getting into a situation where, and we've seen this personally, it where lenders are getting a little bit more twitchy, and I think that they're going to be a little bit more discerning over who they're going to take on as a risk. And that's a really dangerous situation to be in, because if we get stagflation, which is prolonged inflation, and we get rising interest rates, and we have a lending crisis, that is a recipe for a disaster. And I think that the UK really is treading a tightrope in some ways. And I think that the government and the Bank of England are going to need to work some magic to be able to have some kind, I know the Americans call it a soft landing, but a situation where people don't get hurt too much. And this is why ultimately, I mean, I did a podcast interview yesterday with the Bitcoin Collective guys. They're putting on the Bitcoin conference in Edinburgh in a couple of months' time. And we were talking about this, is like, how can Bitcoin practically solve some of this problem? And honestly, we just came to the same conclusion that the more people that know about how the monetary system works and how Bitcoin works, the better. And if people can just start getting off of holding zero Bitcoin, it's a bloody good start. Because if you'd have held Bitcoin 10 years ago, I mean, on average, it goes up every year. Yes, you see some dips, but I don't know what other solutions there are for people. Really, is like, where do you? There's no safe haven as such. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, my view is that if more people understood how the global economy worked and how central banks worked, then I think there would have been anarchy years ago. I think that people would have risen up and absolutely put a stop to it, because quantitative easing is essentially theft from the people, and it's been used as a tool now for far too long. And it causes inflation, and people don't realize that when inflation is high, the money in your bank account and the money in your back pocket essentially becomes worthless. I think for the average Joe, because inflation happens over such a long period of time, we don't notice it so much. But I was listening to an economist talk about what inflation means for hedge funds the other day. And his view was that if a hedge fund is not doubling its assets under management or doubling the size of its portfolio every 10 years, then they're essentially losing 50% of its spending power, because inflation cuts in half its run rate. So this is a huge problem, and the central banks know that this is something which they're causing. But unfortunately, debt is like a drug, and they just can't stop printing money now. There is no soft landing. Inflation is not transitory. We have to stop saying things like that. The economic system is fundamentally broken, and the only way to fix it, I believe, is by moving to a truly open source monetary system that is completely uncorruptible. And I hope that people start to understand that. I think Bitcoin is the life raft, and unfortunately the global economy is a sinking ship. But trying to explain that to the layman in the pub, it's not easy.
No, I was thinking about this the other day, which is that in the UK, traditionally, home ownership is a big deal. And I understand why, like from a philosophical reason and from an economic reason. And what we've seen over the last several decades is house prices increasing year on year on year, and they're just going up and up and up. And what people don't realize is that it's actually the value of the pound that's going down. So it looks like house prices are going up. And because we've had, like in previous generations, especially the boomers, although most of them are homeowners, they've had options to like release equity, and they're like, yeah, I know there's inflation and things are going up, but my house that I bought for 100k in 1980 is now worth 950k. That's been a good investment. The problem now comes is when you've got the millennials that can't get on the property ladder, and they're saying, what the hell am I supposed to do? I earn, let's just say I earn a good salary. I live in London, and I'm a millennial, and I work for one of the big banks or an investment firm, and yet I still can't afford to buy a house. And the further that gets pushed down the line, I think the more pushback there's going to be. And I think without people like looking at their assets and saying, well, at least my home's gone up 900% over the last 30, 40 years. But yeah, my savings have sort of, they're up and down. People are a little bit more appeased by that, I think. So these things have to change.
Wages do not typically rise in line with inflation. And even if they did rise in line with inflation, inflation is, of course, the reported CPI figure, which doesn't include volatile items like food and housing. So if wages rose in line with inflation, that would be great for the average Joe. If it rose in line with real inflation, which included all of these volatile aspects, then that would be even better. But what we're seeing now is private companies making record profits. In the UK at the moment, we've got companies like BP that are reporting almost double the profits that they made last year, right in the middle of an energy crisis. It's absolutely infuriating. And there really is very, very little that we can do about it until, in the UK, we get to vote in a couple of years. But I think it's a difficult time. And I don't think that the global economic policies are making this any easier for the average Joe. I think fundamentally it needs to change.
You can't have sound economic policies if you have an unsound, unethical global monetary system. It's impossible. And that leads me on to like closing today's show is that next week, next Tuesday, we're interviewing a very big guest, an amazing person. Greg Foss is coming on the show to talk about these issues. Now, Greg's a Canadian. He's very tuned into the US market. But, you know, regardless of where you live and where you're listening to the show from, that if the global monetary system is flawed, then it affects every single country, some more than others. So we've got loads of questions for him. I think that's going to be a fantastic interview. So make sure you look out for that one.
It will. I've been following Greg on Twitter for a long time and I enjoy his video content. He gives a real funny, good rant. He does. I think he used to work in, you used to work in the credit market. And he's a fascinating guy and will no doubt be a very entertaining interview. He's very well known and incredibly knowledgeable. So please do tune into that one.
Perfect. Well, Ben, it's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful time in Copenhagen and safe travels back to the UK. Normal UK service will be resumed next week. So thanks for tuning in and make sure you follow us at crypto_Twitter to get all the latest crypto news from around the world.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. It would mean the world to us if you could leave a review wherever you're listening. This really does help and allows other people to find us online. You can keep up to date with new releases of the podcast by subscribing and following us on Twitter or Instagram for the latest crypto-related news. Information provided by Crypto Pulse via this podcast, website, social media channels, and any other medium does not constitute financial advice, investment recommendations, or any other type of advice whatsoever. The Crypto Pulse team are not professional financial advisors. Trading and purchasing cryptocurrencies do carry risks, and anybody wishing to partake in such activities should seek professional advice.